I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hate collectivism in all its forms, and I'm going to tell you a little tiny bit of why. I could go on for hours about this. First, what is collectivism? Well, it takes many forms, the most commonly known of which is communism. And communism slash socialism, they're both the same, by the way. The idea that communism is worse than socialism is nonsense. They are both the same. Karl Marx, who was the propagandist of communism, said that he was talking about socialism. And he considered himself a socialist, and he was. Anyway, the thing I hate most about collectivism is its contempt for the individual and all individual liberty. Collectivism always involves contempt for the individual, the demand that everyone conform to the collective, which is always, of course, represented by the government. The government is always in charge because it's the one that can force everyone to comply. That's what governments have. They have the power of violence, and they can force everyone to comply. It's basically like the mob, except it's legitimate. When the government does it, it's the law. Anyway, collectivism actually has many forms. It's not just that. It can also involve a whole way of thinking. When you think collectivistically, you think about people as being in groups. You don't think about the individual. You look at someone and you say, oh, that's a black person. Whenever you hear people saying, that's the first black person who succeeded at whatever, they're talking collectivistically. They are identifying that person as being a black person as opposed to being who they really are. And nobody is just a black person or a white person. Everyone's an individual. And one of the fundamental things about collectivism, it denies the individual soul. In fact, fundamental to collectivism always, even among people who claim to be both collectivists and having a religion, is contempt for God. Because ultimately the collectivist wants everyone to think of the government as the God, the giver of everything, the punisher and the rewarder of everything, the one who has the right to all property and dispensing it as the government wants. But remember, whenever we're talking about the government, it's not some abstract entity. It consists of the people who hold offices within it, the people who are able to exercise the levers of power as a function of being in the government. And most of those people are unelected. They're bureaucrats. But even some of the ones that are elected act like bureaucrats. But if you've ever dealt with bureaucracies, I've been a tax lawyer since 1979. I deal with the IRS all the time. It's a collectivist bureaucracy. And it's the only one of all of those bureaucracies in Washington that actually has a constitutional basis for its existence. Because in 1913, the citizens of this country ratified the 16th Amendment authorizing the income tax, and someone has to collect it. Now, they've been given much more power than the 16th Amendment authorizes. And in another video, I'll tell you exactly why, and I can prove it. But all of those federal bureaucracies in Washington, the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, the FCC, all of them, all of those ones with initials, they're endless. There are thousands of them. They don't even know how many there are. But they've got millions of employees in Washington. And each one of those is its own collective. And the nature of bureaucracy, which is always involved in collectivism. Collectivism is always enforced, and that's what's always involved, because the only way you get everyone to do things that are being directed by the collective is to make them do it. Yes, you can reward them, but mostly you have to punish them if they don't do it. And that's the way it always works. And each of those agencies, like all collectivist entities, there's one fundamental thing. They don't believe in God, and they don't treat people as having individual souls. So that the whole thing is so cold-blooded If you've ever dealt with a bureaucrat or any bureaucracy, you have some idea of it. But the more you deal with them, the more you realize it's always the same. The bureaucracy is always created under the pretext that it's going to help the citizens' health or safety, or various versions of that. They're going to protect people from evil corporations doing whatever. And that's been the pretext for setting all these things up, ever since the first one was set up in 1887. The Interstate Commerce Commission. And by the way, the Jimmy Carter presidency, which was very left-wing, did an analysis of that Interstate Commerce Commission after it had been around for almost 100 years. And they concluded it was absolutely worthless. It was formed, just like all these agencies, because they claimed that railroads in particular were gouging people. And they wanted to have a protection for the little guy from the gouging by the railroads. In fact, what railroads were doing was they were engaging in what's called price discrimination, where big customers got discounts, volume discounts. That's what always happens in real business. Anyway, a bunch of Marxists, and yes, that's what they were, in the Midwest, got all riled about this. And first they wanted the states to get involved in telling the railroad how to run their business. And then they realized that under the Constitution, they're not allowed to do that. We have what's called the contract clause in the Constitution, plus the interstate commerce clause. Even the states recognized that prevented the states from regulating railroads going across state lines. Anyway, they realized they couldn't do that, so they got the federal government to do it. And it happens that because these collectivist bureaucracies are always corrupt, the railroads went along with it. They were familiar with what happens when these bureaucracies get involved in dictating how a business operates, because that's the way it's been done in Europe for hundreds of years. That's why Europe has the sclerotic economy, because the whole thing is run by bureaucrats. And bureaucrats don't produce anything. All they do is they tell other people how to run their business. And that's what these bureaucracies do. But one of the reasons they're so terrible, a major reason, I mean, there are so many reasons, I could go on and on, but they all have all three powers of government. They write what they call regulations, which are laws. The three powers of government are legislative, executive, and judicial, and each one of those agencies have all three. Our Constitution forbids any entity from having all three, because James Madison, who was the principal author of the Constitution, expressed precisely why. He said any entity that has all three powers of government is, and I'm quoting, the very definition of tyranny. And it's true. That's why they divided the powers among the three separate branches. And that's why all of those bureaucracies are unconstitutional. But they also only serve their own ends, and the ends of the businesses that are forced to live under them, which then get intertwined with them. And what happens is the existing businesses are the only ones that can survive the regulations that are created by those agencies. So they become a functional oligopoly. It becomes impossible or very difficult for new businesses to enter the market. And the whole market freezes. There's no more innovation. New businesses are locked out. There's no benefit to the existing business to improve what they provide, because they're going to have to beg permission from the bureaucrats to do it, for one, and they're not going to get any benefit from doing it. So the whole thing becomes just pure bureaucracy. And that's what collectivists do. They hate individuals, they have contempt for God, and they corrupt and poison every part of the economy they get involved in. And they're always created supposedly to help everyone in dealing with that part of the economy, and they do just the opposite. As Jimmy Carter's administration determined when it came to the Interstate Commerce Commission, they determined that, yes, it had been around for 100 years. It hadn't improved a single thing. It had been fabulously expensive. And by the way, all the costs of the bureaucracy are always borne indirectly by the customers, because they end up having to pay for all that. The money to pay for the bureaucracy has to come from somewhere, and the only ones it can come from are the customers who buy the service of the business, which is regulated by the bureaucracy. And that's the form that collectivism takes in America, those bureaucracies. In Soviet Union, the government just owned everything outright. In America, the government doesn't need to, because it has functional control over all those businesses. That's what those bureaucracies give it, and it's completely unconstitutional. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you're interested in what I'm talking about, please follow me. There will be more like this.